Instagram. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I am one of two lead faculty for clinical management of the fitness, athlete, pregnancy, and postpartum. Hello, everybody on Facebook. If you missed my introduction, my name is Christina Previtt. I am one of two lead faculty for clinical management of the fitness, athlete, pregnancy, and postpartum. We have an 8-week online course where we go through all things female athlete, where we start from preconception and we go all the way to returning to gymnastics, running, endurance movements, and strength-based sport. If you are interested in getting into our next cohort, we start May 4th and we're almost 60% full already, which is super exciting. So do not delay because seats are going very, very quickly. All right, and if you have been following ICE for a long time, you know that we love a good bias check because sometimes we can be really set in our beliefs and we need to make sure that we are staying up to date with the literature so that we have the most well-rounded point of view when it comes to different topics. If you've been following me, you know that I am a big advocate for allowing women, despite what part of their motherhood journey they are in, to be able to lift heavy things off the floor. Probably because I love lifting heavy things off the floor. And there was a study that came out that is ahead of print for June that came out of Peter Heinz's lab that essentially said that heavy lifting, that heavy lifting is linked to risk of prolapse. And in particular, there's a trend towards an increased risk in the posterior compartment. So we're going to talk about this because this goes directly against some of the things that we are teaching in the clinical management of the fitness athlete course. And so this is something that could really potentially change some of our perceptions. So what are some of the good things that Peter Heinz, his group, he wasn't the first author, he was the PI, primary investigator or principal investigator in the study. What were some of the good things that they did? So this was a retrospective study. So it took individuals and interviewed them about their previous habits. And they did two different types of analysis of pelvic organ prolapse. They did anatomical POP and subjective assessment. So assessing for symptoms like bulging in the vaginal area, feelings of pelvic heaviness, pain with intercourse, etc. And we've done previous episodes that have looked at the association between anatomical and subjective symptoms of pelvic organ prolapse and have shown that there is a very large disconcordance between anatomical and subjective symptoms, similar to a disc herniation. So one of the positive things that they did in this study was they did both. So they looked at the risk factors for pelvic organ prolapse and how they linked to subjective symptoms of pelvic organ prolapse, POP, I'm just going to say POP, and the anatomical descent of the pelvic organs towards the vaginal. I think is going to need to be the gold standard going forward because of this variation that we're starting to see. And so that was great. And then what they did is they took different lifestyle factors, so smoking, asthma, and lifting, and they put it into a regression analysis and they looked at univariate and multivariate modeling. This is where it gets very, very important that clinicians understand statistics. So on univariate analysis, pelvic organ prolapse had a 1.71 times increased risk compared to those who didn't heavy lift. So women who heavy lifted had a 1.7 times increased odds of having a prolapse. Sorry, my connection's a little bit wonky. Had an increased odds of prolapse compared to those who didn't. And so that is really significant and really important. So what they did was, when we're thinking about the statistics, I'm just going to go on with a thing. So when we think about the statistics, we have to think about what causes these statistics to happen. So when we put it through, we say, okay, here's prolapse and here is our demographic factors. Cool. Then we take those that are statistically significant and put them into a multivariate model. What we mean by that is we're going to take all of the factors that we know are risk factors for prolapse, and we're going to add these risk factors that we're now identifying as potentially new risk factors and seeing if it makes our model more predictive or stronger. What they showed was on multivariate modeling that it was no longer statistically significant. And why is that extremely, extremely important? The reason why that is important is because it means when you take into account the other known risk factors for prolapse, including vaginal parity, so number of vaginal births, levator ani trauma, so any perennial tearing that occurs or any disruption to the levator ani muscle that occurs, especially with higher risk or higher instrumented vaginal delivery, or any type of avulsion that can occur between the bottom of the vaginal opening and the beginning of the anal sphincter. And those are known risk factors for pelvic organ prolapse. So when they take those confounding variables and place them into the regression model, it no longer becomes statistically significant. What that means is that that risk factor is not more significant than understanding a person's vaginal parity and obstetrical history when it comes to risk of pelvic organ prolapse. That was number one. So when you look at it that way, we actually cannot identify that heavy lifting is a risk factor for prolapse because parity is still the number one risk factor, whether you lift heavy weights or not. One thing that was interesting, though, is that they said that it was the only risk factor that was a trend towards having a specific compartment be more at risk, and that was the posterior compartment, so a rectocele. I find that extremely, extremely interesting. So although we can't say that heavy lifting is linked to prolapse based on this study, it's fascinating to see these trends because we know that one of the true known risk factors is chronic constipation. That wasn't included in the multivariate model, which I thought was interesting, but that's a whole aside. And so it's interesting that we're seeing this because when we're bearing down, when we brace and lift heavy weights, it's very similar to bearing down as we are trying to have a bowel movement when we are constipated. And so this is kind of linking to what we're talking about with the bracing strategy and how important it is with that bracing strategy to be very aware of trying to avoid bearing down, especially for women who are lifting heavy weights. So that's kind of consistent with what we're seeing in our anecdotal clinical evidence. The third thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to this study is how they talked about heavy lifting. So when you go through the methods, it says we asked women if they've done any heavy lifting. They didn't talk about conceptualizing what heavy lifting was. So they didn't talk about how many times per week, was this recreational lifting, was this occupational heavy lifting, which we know is a known risk factor for pelvic organ prolapse. So all of these things, they didn't conceptualize. So it could have been, before this interview, have you lifted heavy weights for a 6-month span, whether it be recreationally or occupationally? That could have been the question. And if that's the question, we're not actually getting at the lifting piece. Because if you are occupational heavy lifting and you're going back 6 weeks postpartum and you're going back to 40 hours a week of occupational lifting and loading, when your body hasn't realigned with pelvic supports and collagen supports, ligamentous supports in that pelvic girdle, that pelvic diaphragm, then that is very different than a gradual reintroduction of loading after, the appropriate healing time. And 40 hours versus, 45 minutes of really heavy lifting when you consider warm up, cool down, and warm up sets, there's just no comparison between the two. And so it'll be important if they're doing follow-up on this to really conceptualize what they mean. So when Lori Forner did her cross-sectional survey that looked at 4,000 women who are recreationally heavy lifters, and compared that to individuals who did not lift weights, she said, lifting at over 15 kilos for sport versus lifting under 15 kilos. And there was just a delineation of the weight of the barbell, the classic female barbell. And she was able to see this differentiation. She made that kind of dichotomy. And her further work, I'm sure, is going to continue to do that. And her and I have had conversations about how to truly get at women who are lifting heavy weights. And do we use percentages of 1 rep max? And we've had these conversations because it's nuanced. Just like the differentiation between lifting weights and weightlifting, these types of semantics are extremely important for allowing us to draw certain conclusions. And so coming back full circle, if you go into the discussion of this paper, the author makes a horribly overstated claim that this study adds to the ideology that heavy lifting may be bad for women. And that was what got me fired up. I was like, you cannot, on a univariate analysis, that is so you can't even do that. I can't even get words. You cannot do that. You cannot state that claim because we do not have the evidence to support that. And we do not have should not be trying to scare women into not lifting weights, especially when multivariate analysis, this was no longer statistically significant, which meant that parity was still the most important factor and it had nothing to do with lifting. So kind of just going full circle with this study, it is really, really important that PTs, one, read the entire paper because this does not actually go against our biases at all. Number two, it is important that you understand statistics. And I hate statistics more than anybody else. I totally get that. But it is important to understand what a regression analysis is, what a univariate versus a multivariate logistical regression looks like, and why that is important, because that'll completely change how you interpret this study if you understand the statistics and what that means. You have to do a univariate model to show statistical significance before you can justify putting it into a multivariate regression. But the multivariate regression is the predictive one because it is not a prolapse and heavy lifting. You have to consider all of these other really clinically important things. And if you're not putting into account these confounding variables, you are missing a significant piece of the puzzle and you may not actually be predicting anything, which is what we saw with this study. All right. I hope you found that helpful. I'm going to post an infographic on my personal page later on today that kind of highlights it. If you're looking for the citation, I can post it below. It is still ahead of print, so it's still double spaced. It hasn't even been kind of formatted for the journal, but super interesting that more people are looking at this data. And I hope that more studies like this come out and we can have more really helpful discussions. All right. I'll see you all on Wednesday for Dairy on Ice. Otherwise, have a great Monday.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.